All right, everyone, time is up. Quick roll call. Is the Yogyakarta here?
Yep, we're here.
Great. Banten, are you all complete?
Banten is complete.
Awesome. So welcome to the semifinal round of NSDC 2020. So we're going to debate under the motion, this House will mandate cremation upon death. So quick introduction on the judges. So my name is Tengku Omar from UNPAD. I will be your chair today. And then we will have Adfikri from Universitas Indonesia, Axel Octarino from Universitas Katolik Parayangan, Bobi Ongkojoyo from Universitas Surabaya, Dia Anissa Aprilia from Universitas Tadulako, Gabriel Charlotte from Universitas Indonesia, Jane Revevalin from ITB, Muhammad Firman Syahwana from Universitas Hasanuddin, and Rizky Akita from Universitas Diponegoro. So without further ado, let's call upon the first speaker of the government side of the house. And please, for all speakers, make sure that you share to us what's your preferred POI method. Thank you. Now let's call upon the first speaker here.
Hello, am I audible? Okay. My preferred POI method is just voice. Just unmute yourself. Okay. I will be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem on the opposition side is that in the status quo, funeral companies capitalize on the grievances of families losing a loved one, which allows them to jack up the prices for conserving these natural deaths, these bodies. It ruins the natural process of decomposition process and takes up already scarce places for these people to be buried. Our mechanism, or the way we will implement this motion, is that upon death, it will be mandatory for the bodies to be cremated, and we will be disallowing other methods of body disposal, and for example, embalming and etc., or burials or through coffins. And not only that, but we will be giving government-provided facilities for these cremation processes. Our burden of proof on why it's justified to mandate cremation, on how it's within the interest of the victims of death and within the interests of the government. As a disclaimer, its important figures will also be mandatory to be cremated. However, we will still be allowing other forms of appreciation, for example, building statues for these people or etc. Now, moving on to my urgency. Well, in the status quo, grievances from a lost one is one of the biggest emotions people face. And it's also when the people are most vulnerable in their lives. They have a sense of guilt, they felt as if they could have done something different to actually better preserve that person who, by the end of the day, passed away. And not only that, but they feel a sense of responsibility to actually pay back to all the things that the person has done in their life, to actually pay back all the benefits they have been provided by that lost person. They feel a responsibility to properly give a proper funeral and respect that person. This is what enables funeral companies to have more leverage when they're making funeral plans. The proper way to handle a body actually hasn't been determined yet, and which allows these funeral companies to be able to fill in that gap and to characterize the proper way for these funerals to actually be handled. However, because the government has failed to provide this way, provide the actual ways to handle these proper burials, it allows these people to actually have more leverage. For example, they can have a sense of preservation for these funerals, which allows embalming to jack up the prices, and that not only that, but they can give a sense of responsibility that you have to splurge on these funerals or these conservation processes. For example, and how even coffins in the US can go up to $12,000 in prices, which is very detrimental for the people who actually have just lost an important one in their families, where they're the most economically vulnerable. And not only that, but also embalming and other preservatives is also very expensive. And not only that, but it's also making it harder to decomposition, which is very harmful for the environment, which can make it harder to actually decompose. And it takes up spaces for further construction on that burial site. And not only that, but it's also going to become a battle of the contractors. For example, on how you cannot, if you are not able to pay the facilities or the places or the land that you buried their relatives in, then you're going to be there. It's very possible that the contractors will sell it to a different place to build a hospital or etc., which is very detrimental for the mental health and etc. So why are the other exit mechanisms simply not working? Why can't we simply opt out for the cremation? Why do we have to make it mandatory for these people? Well, we believe that the industry has already made it clear that it's the best way to dispose of a body, ladies and gentlemen. And they have already socialized that it's the most formal and most respectable way. So it's very hard for these people who are most vulnerable to suggestions to actually think of a different alternative. And not only that, but because it's constantly being advertised that way, many people simply aren't exposed many people aren't exposed to the ways of cremation, so they won't even consider it in the first place, ladies and gentlemen. But not only that, but because of that, of a social consensus, even if they do know, it's a societal pressure that's being placed upon these people. They're pressured to actually confirm with how everyone else is actually doing it. Now, provided, well, we believe that it's the secondly most wide. Hello? Where did I last leave off?
Okay, from my side, last time the last thing that you argued was about how some people has not been exposed to the cremation. That's why they're not familiar with it. That's the last one I heard.
Okay. I'll be starting my timer from 4 minutes, 20 seconds. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. But not only that, but it's also the societal pressure, which allows them to actually pressure these people into joining this body disposal process. And not only that, but why it has to be cremation, because it's the second most widely accepted procedure. So it's going to have minimal backlash in the society. It's also cheap. It's only going to cost a couple $100s compared to the multiple thousands of dollars on their side of the house. And it's also the one that has the most facilities, so the government won't have to splurge that much on providing the facilities. So now moving on to my efficacy argument, why it's effective in catering to the interests of the victims. Well, I have already characterized on it's very expensive for these people to actually have these to have these burial processes. For example, they will need to pay to actually have a constant contracting for that place, but they will also need to pay for the funerals itself, for the coffins, and for the embalming and etc. On our side of the house, we'll be able to provide the gap, which gives a clear depiction on how bodies will be able to handle, which is going to be much less expensive on our side of the house. It's only going to cost a couple $100s. They can simply keep it in a vase instead of spending it on thousands of dollars on a coffin, ladies and gentlemen. And not only that, but it's also going to give a lot of much more emotional closure. For example, they don't have to have to constantly go to actually maintain that burial place. They won't actually have to constantly fight for that place to not be taken over. For the people who are more wealthy, will actually have their other burial places built on top of those. But also why it's effective in creating the interest of the government. Well, we believe that these burial processes on these burial places, it's a very scarce in the first place. There are multiple cities that simply don't have enough burial space, so they have to constantly be building upon each other. Or not only that, but they have to go out of town to actually find a place to actually bury these places, which makes it hinder the government's ability to actually have spaces for these people to be buried, and it hinders the ability to build facilities, for example, on how to build hospitals or etc. On our side of the house, now we're going to be able to actually give an endless supply. We're going to give an endless supply. Hello, am I freezing?
No, you're not.
Oh, okay. Can I change my Wi-Fi? It's disconnecting on my side. Mm. Okay.
I'm sorry, everyone. I was the one who got disconnected. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yep. Sorry. Let me check my notes. Yeah. So the last thing I heard, the clock is paused at 6 minutes and 5 seconds. And the last argument that I heard was about areas just do not have enough space to do the usual burial. So you can begin from there. Sorry for the inconvenience.
I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Okay, so what will happen on our side of the house, on the government side of the house? Well, we believe that we can actually be able to focus these facilities rather than actually giving it to burial sites and the constantly taking up a space for these burials. We'll be able to actually build facilities, for example, hospitals, to better care for these patients so we can further prevent these deaths or etc. Or we can actually build other facilities. And not only that, but because death is actually experienced by the most people, we believe that by providing these facilities, for example, on cremation, we'll be able to capitalize on that. For example, we will be able to provide these cremation processes, and we will actually be able to make a profit in these cremation processes. So we will be able to have further taxes for these people, and but it won't be jacked up prices because we will be regulated by the government, and we will be able to further make sure that we have funding for the government by the end of the day. So moving on to the justification. So why is it justified to limit individuals' right of choosing their burial method? Well, firstly, because we're actually protecting our citizens from becoming the victims of these funeral industries of capitalism. The entity that's actually exploiting them is the funeral industry, and that's checking up the prices. Secondly, as the government, we have the interest to end inequality. This kind of disparity and and finalizes the concept that a person deserves more and is better than the other. And it's unjustified because just because you're rich, you deserve to be remembered more. All people are buried equal on our side of the house. They're lifeless and can't do anything anymore. Furthermore, the reason why rich families decorate and make fancy graves makes the illusions that they're good people who deserve the best place in heaven. Meanwhile, the reality is that more often than not, they have gained the wealth from exploiting other workers. So on our side of the house, we're going to be able to make sure that these people aren't emotionally exploited, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to make sure that they can have sustainable means of burial, and we're going to be able to ensure that's within the interest of the government and it's within the interest of these people. Therefore, and it's justified to do so. You should vote for Team Government.
All right, thank you for the speech. Now to open the case of the opposition, let's call upon the first speaker of the opposition. Here.
Am I audible? Okay. For POI, I prefer if you unmute yourself and just interrupt my speech. I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, we think that it's very dismissive for a side proposition to generalize every single culture that people would do when they are grieving, and how they respect the dead, right? Realize how there's obviously like a range of culture, like the Mayan tribe, for example, and how they let their people, how they like let the body stay for a while because they wanted to still respect them as like people who are alive, right? Realize how these kinds of culture will be erased under side proposition exactly because all of them are going to be cremated. We think that this justification should come on their next speaker, right? So with that being said, I'm going to have 2 points of argument in this debate. Firstly, as to why then it's unjustifiable for us to just generalize all of these culture, but secondly, as to how then on our side of the house, we can create more closure for the victim and why then that is the most important thing in this debate. But before that, a few points mechanism and rebuttal, right? So what is it we're going to do under our side of the house? Firstly, we're going to actually let people choose how they want it to be buried, right? We're going to have multiple choices. For example, if you want it to be buried in the ground, or if you want it to be cremated, or if you want your bodies to be put in the rocks, like what people in Dora did this, for example. I think that this is exactly the kind of world that we support under opposition, right? So with that being said, let's move on then to the rebuttal, right? So the biggest case that comes from side proposition is the fact that funeral companies are exploiting people's grief, right? Well, we question firstly, why then this wouldn't happen under side proposition? Because the moment that you are going to do cremation, like obviously the ones that are going to do this is obviously companies, right? So we don't really understand how then this kind of exploitation will only happen under our side of the house, right? But secondly, realize how and then they say all of these things regarding like inequality, right? But realize panels how sometimes people do feel like the only way for them to be able to respect the dead people is for them to splurge a lot of money, right? That is the way for them to say thank you to these people for the life that they have lived on, right? But even if like there are going to be like poor people, for example, who cannot afford like funerals, for example, obviously under our side of the house, we're also still going to be able to give them choices, right? There are other like multiple cheaper choices. We think that all of these things will still happen under our side of the house. We don't think that the harm they're trying to put under side proposition is something that's very exclusive, right? So let's move on to the first argument, right, regarding the principal justification and why it's unjustifiable for us to generalize these like burial cultures, right? Firstly, because realize how we cannot erase culture for uncertain benefits, right? Realize how these culture have literally been done for like centuries, like hundreds of years, right? How the Mayan tribe let the body stay in one place and give them like food or cigarettes, for example, because that is how they want to like achieve their closure, right? We think that it's very harmful when you dismiss all of these cultures and only think of the benefit, because we question how then are how are the likelihood of the benefit going to be successful, right? Okay, maybe you will get more land, but how then are you going to be able to use that land? How then are you going to generate as much profit from that land, right? But secondly, realize that even if the benefit is like sure, for example, how then are they going to ensure that the benefit will go to the right person? How then are they going to ensure that the benefit can also be received by the victims in and of itself, right? We don't think that it's going to be good. But secondly, realize panels how death is a spiritual thing, right? You can't just simply weigh the benefit of closure and the benefit and like environmental benefit or economic benefit, right? Realize how, because exactly it's so spiritual, that it's so hard for people to be rational when they are facing these kinds of actions, right? We question how would people feel like when they are being mandated to actually be to be like cremated, right? Because realize that because it's very spiritual, like most likely people are not going to be willing to trade it off simply with some economic benefit, right? You can't just simply just get used to it, right? Death is already so uncertain. We don't think that you would want to be bombarded we don't think that you would want to be like bombarded with this change that's going to be very drastic, right? But thirdly, because we think that this is the only way for us to be able to respect people who are going to die, right? Realize how there are a lot of person who wanted to be buried in the ground, right? Because it is their belief that that in order for them to get into heaven, for example, they do have to oblige to these rules, right? We think that exactly because of that, cremation is not going to be an idea that people will accept that easily, like what side proposition tell you, because this is literally the idea that has been planted to you since you're in elementary school, right? We think that people most likely will not want to just like easily opt into cremation, exactly because they're afraid, for example, if they're going to be cremated, that they're not going to get into heaven, right? We think that exactly because of that, it's unjustifiable for you to just generalize everything, for you to just dismiss all of these
why?
people who wanted to be buried properly. Before I move on to my second argument, yes.
Don't you think that exactly fear of cremation is going that people want to respect the people who are dying, do you think that's going to be utilized by these companies to actually jack up the prices and make it more expensive?
But we don't really understand. We don't really understand why companies would want to like do that, like to begin with, right? We realize that there are companies like San Diego Hills, for example, but realize how there's also a lot of land that is being provided by the government for people, for like funerals, right? We don't really understand, but we don't really understand then why these kinds of problem will not happen under your side of the house when people are cremated, because like obviously there's always going to be like these kinds of like classes and hierarchy under their side of the house, right? We don't think that that's exclusive. So let's move on to the second argument regarding closure. Why then are we going to be able to achieve closure under our side of the house? Firstly, because we give choice to the people itself, right? Realize how sometimes when like people realize how sometimes in order to get closure, like you need to grieve properly, right? You need to grieve in your own way, in your own pace, in a way that you would want to choose. In a way that you want to choose that, right? Some people does find closure when they do see like their parents graveyard, for example, right? And that they are like, and that they are capable of talking to their parents, for example. And realize how when we are going to do this, like realize how when you have choice, you can actually let go of a person with like a happier note, right? Realize how when you are going to like grant this person's last wish, that's exactly the moment in which you are going to be capable to feel like you're a better person. And we think that exactly because of that, it is the only way for you to be able to grieve, right? Because realize how when you are being pushed to like do cremation, for example, you're not going to grieve properly, obviously, because that's not how you would want to do that to begin with, right? But secondly, because we think that when we're not going to do cremation, the letting go process is going to be so much more gradual, right? Realize how death is going to be something that's very like shocking and something that's very sudden, right? Realize how most of the time people would want to see their parents' dead body being buried in under like the ground, right? We think that exactly because of that, it's going to be a much more gradual process in comparison to cremation, where it's just like, yeah, like your parents are just going to be like burned, right? We don't think that that's going to be a good grieving process, right? But lastly, why then is this going to be very important? Exactly because you cannot get back in life unless you are going to grieve properly. For all of those reasons, we're so proud to oppose.
Thank you, first speaker of the opposition team. Now let's go call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Hello. Am I speaking close enough to the mic? Is my voice breaking out?
Nope, all good.
Okay. Hope it stays that way. Right. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The entire leader of opposition speech basically said that they want to uphold culture and they want to uphold closure, right? But it's opposition's burden, if they want to uphold that, to make sure that it's going to be accessible for everyone. Because this is the way that the government actually works, right? You uphold equality whenever it is possible. That's why you make education free whenever it's possible, because it equalizes people's opportunities. That's why you make healthcare free and vaccines free whenever it's possible, because we think it's a human right. We think that people's rights to actually control how people are remembered at their death is also a human right, because death is something that everybody will eventually face, and everybody should be able to remember their families equally. Okay, why in opposition side you cannot uphold that equality? 4 reasons, and these are my responses. Inaccessible to the poor, right? Them saying that they want to decorate the coffin and whatnot is going to be inaccessible to the poor. So that means it's likely that the poor will never even reach closure, right? And we think that the respect to your family should never be measured by how much money you actually spend when they are dead, right? We think that at this point, they actually don't need any more. Like these dead people should actually just be wishing the best for their family and for their family to be able to move on with their death, right? In our side, you get that because you respect these people just by following their morals, just by continuing your father's legacy, for example. We think that this is going to be more accessible for everyone because everyone can actually define it by themselves, like by what their family is asking for them. Like if your family is poor, for example, your dad won't expect you to become a billionaire afterwards, right? But if you're poor and you have a richer relative, for example, then it's likely that in the opposition side, that rich relative will still pressure you to give a funeral that's as good as possible, right? Because death should be sacred whenever it is possible. We think that this is ridiculous. Second response, the state itself cannot guarantee this equality, right? Because even though you actually already have a graveyard, already respected your family, if you're not rich enough, hospitals are built on graveyards all the time. And this is what government is actually doing, right? You cannot defend your graveyard just because you're poor. We think that this is something that's unjustified because you could not even choose to be born poor or rich, right? In government, you full on just use that money for funerals to give people better healthcare, or to just, you don't need to build funerals, you just build hospitals so that people's deaths are actually not that regrettable, right? So that we have better healthcare, so people actually have closure upon their families' deaths. Third response, why it's going to be inaccessible again, right? Okay. We think that not everyone can access even religious rituals in burial, right? Who are these people? We think that these are soldiers who are dying in war, right? There is never time for them to actually conduct a proper burial, to actually make a coffin. It's likely just going to be either mass burials, or in our side, they can actually be sent to the nearest cremation center, right? Which is going to be made accessible by the government. But it's going to be, because cremation is fast, it's going to be possible, and they're still going to be honored equally with everyone else, right? In their side, even though these soldiers are no less honorable than anyone, they don't get the burial that they deserve. We think this is unjustified. Fourth response, even when the cheaper option is possible, we think that people do not have the freedom to opt into the cheaper, right? I'll explain later in my extension. Before my extension, is there any POI? Okay, seems like there's no POI. I think that it's unjustified if you are if just because you're more privileged, you deserve more honor and you deserve more closure in your family in heaven, right? So my extension is going to talk about why opposition side will perpetuate an unhealthy competition in pursuing that more honor in heaven, right? We think that opposition will just try to signify your superiority over someone else's, even working. You can, the government can tax the rich more and give the poor a chance to climb the economic ladder, for example. But death should be equal because at that time, stopping the clock. What's up?
Yeah, we lost you for
sorry.
10 to 15 seconds. It's okay to just turn off your camera. But can you repeat from the part when you say that the one with honor in it? You just started
What?
on that part.
Which honor part? Is it the
That,
soldiers or?
No. About richer. If you are richer, then you're more honored. So
Oh, okay.
that's the last
Okay.
part that I heard before you started lagging.
What's the time?
I already stopped it at 4:12.
4:12. So I have like 4 minutes and a few more seconds. I'll get notified if it's 8 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Also on the 7th.
Okay, cool. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think it's absolutely atrocious to say that you deserve more honor just because you are more privileged, that you deserve a better closure and a better home in heaven just because you're privileged. So my extension is going to talk about how opposition side perpetuates that unhealthy competition to get that closure or to get that honor, right? In opposition, you'll try to signify your superiority over someone else's, even until death. But let's go back to the government, to characterizing the government. We think that government still allows some part of inequality in like economy or other areas. It's because it can be mitigated, right? Because if you work hard in your studies, then you can get into a good college and get a good job. If you rise up in your job because you're more hardworking, then you can actually surpass the people who are above you, right? The government will happily tax the rich more and like give the poor a chance to climb the economic ladder, right? But death should be something that's equal, because after death, there is no other option to mitigate like how respectable your family is going to be, right? In their side, when you have graveyards, in the afterlife, you finalize the message that I am still more privileged than you, that I'm still more than you, even though you are already dead, right? We think that this is toxic because of two reasons. Firstly, we think that there are already many people in the status quo who humiliate people who cannot afford good funerals. These are grandmothers in funerals secretly gossiping like this funeral isn't luxurious enough, although the family of the dead ones are already grieving, right? This backlashes what opposition wants, which is respect for the dead anyway, right? You cannot guarantee that. Secondly, old people are also likely to pressure their children to get a lot of money to make a good funeral for their arrogance and for their insecurity in society, right? My funeral has to be better than your previous, than your sister's parent, for example, or your cousin's parent, right? Even though that money could have been used for the child's education or self-improvement, which is actually just going to better like teach them good values in their life actually, and make them able to actually have closure after the death, because they can actually have a proper life, right? We think that when you cannot fulfill that in the opposition side, it's as if that your family in heaven is not going to be ever happy and you will never reach that closure. We think this is harmful, right? Even if you can like upgrade the grave or change that, we think that this is going to be unnecessary competition, right? It's going to look very bad in the opposition side, because if you go to a graveyard, for example, right, you're going to like walk around and you're going to compare how much this family respected their parents, how much this family respected their grandparents, right? Although everybody actually had different life conditions, and not everybody can actually can actually afford a good funeral, right? Just maybe because of their money, or maybe because they didn't have the time, maybe they were working abroad, right? We think that the assumption that everyone can actually access good funerals is going to be harmful to the family's perception, which is unjust because they couldn't choose to have the better funeral. We think this is toxic because actually no life is over any other life, right? Even though you are like you achieved more than someone else in life, it's probably because of luck, right? It's probably because you were lucky that you had a good education, because you were rich, right? We think that no life should be upheld over. Okay, still some. Okay, we think that no life should be upheld over any other life, right? That's why in our side we uphold the principle that everyone should have the same amount of respect paid to them after their death. Vote for government.
All right, thank you to the second speaker of the government team. Now let's call upon the second speaker of the opposition team. Here.
Am I audible?
Okay.
Thanks. Let me set my timer first. By the way, if you want to do POI, just unmute it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, I think it's very assumptive when side proposition are trying to say that everyone have the same values, that everyone have the same meaning of life. When my previous previous people already told you on so many layers that people don't have the same values. They have different kind of thing to accept this kind of value. Closure. This is something that we never get any responses towards proposition case. But panels, I don't think we should do any kind of trade-off that works in a very different ground. You can't ask me to choose whether I want to eat or do my prayers because I simply can't live with either of them. This is why on side proposition they are debating on a very different ground. They do trade off on something that cannot be traded. Why is it so problematic? Because their side are too generalized that all people have the same values and expecting that everyone will get the same benefit on what they want. Because realize if you ask a conservative Muslim, of course they will be harmed rather than benefit because religion is something that they uphold so much. So in this debate, I have three things I want to discuss. Firstly, on why our side is more aligned to the principle of someone's death, and secondly, on why our side will bring more benefits.
Before
towards
that.
society, and thirdly, I will add an extension as to how our side and their side will only backlash on how we provide better growth. So on the first class, on why our side is
UI.
more aligned to the principle before extension, to someone's death. Firstly, they say about social pressure. We think this is one of the biggest case coming from side proposition. They say that we think we have they will force someone to do this same thing. Firstly, panels realize that in our side, choice still exists. In the status quo, there are Muslims that use cemeteries and Hindus that cremate, and they never force its other values to do the same thing. But panels, secondly, even if they want to talk about different economic data, it will also people will also not force someone else economic status, right? Because realize in our side of the house there are people that use Gucci, for example, and there's also people that use simple bag, and they don't force each other to use the same kind of values. This is something that I don't understand towards proposition case. But secondly, realize that in their side pressure will be far more worse because there are people that values their religion so much. For example,
why?
Muslim, literally you have to bury your dead. That literally says in the Quran. When you don't follow this religion, you will feel more pressure because you believe that your family's dead, for example. They will never go to heaven. But thirdly, there are spectrums of prices. Panels realize that all cemeteries are going to have very different price. There are cemeteries that maybe can cost a lot more money, but there are always other cemeteries that are alternative that you can do. Panels realize that this isn't true, right? Because many people are dying daily, meaning that many vulnerable companies, there is a competition. This means there will always be a check and balance to make these companies to have like more affordable pricing in the status quo. But secondly, on how they say it will be an asymmetric towards the rich and the poor because they will respect other people less, and how they say will capitalize the grave. Panels realize in their own mechanism, they say that they will still make statues towards someone dead. I don't get why in their side capitalizing someone dead won't still exist, right? This is so inexclusive because both sides, whether you want to do this or not, people capitalizing from someone dead will still exist. But panels realize that in our side, realize that you're being respected, that you and how you respect other people are mostly because you are respected by your own families, because your families and your closest one won't just respect you less just because you are being a vulnerable that is putting less towards other people. We think that these families will still respect you anyway. I don't get on why on the picturization of how side of proposition give you that all of your families are robots that don't have any kind of like emotional feelings towards your dad. But now let's move on to my second class. But before that, is there any POI? No? Okay,
Can you
let's move on to my
explain?
second.
Sorry. Can you explain on
Okay.
how the average cost of a coffin in America is $1,200? If people have healthy competition, why is it still so expensive?
Panels, I think side proposition are being too neglecting on which spectrum that you want to try, right? Because realize we always have like any other choice towards on what kind of you want to approach. For example, you don't always have to use coffins, for example, that is very pricey. Or like in Muslim, for example, you can just like use like fabric. You can just use fabric that can carry that can like carry you to that, for example. And not like everyone want to have like the same amount of pricing as you do. But okay, let's move on to my second class on why our site brings better benefits. Okay, so firstly they say about on how like it will they will want to build other facilities on how we think that I think it's moral when they want to substitute someone debt to economies. We think that debt itself is inevitable. We think that when you want to give proper healthcare, these people will still be dying anyway, right? But realize a proper healthcare itself is also not accessible to all people. So I'm not sure what they are trying to stand for. But secondly, on how they say not everyone get the proper memorials, for example, they don't respect soldiers the same way. We have panels realize that in status quo itself, we have grave that literally only for the soldiers. We have cemeteries for them. But crucially, in our side, you will respect soldiers more when you see hectares of land on someone of that. You realize on how many people that are fighting for the nation every time you cross that cemeteries when you are like crossing that kind of road that are being placed that are like side to side from those cemeteries. In their side, you don't have like this kind of emotional attachment that exists in our current status quo. But now let's move on to my extension on how backlash and we provide better approach. Panels realize that there are so many people that are looking for their values. They wouldn't trade off these values on the mundane benefits that they expect everyone will accept. We think that when you make it mandatory, you make the conservative backlash to the government because realize the government has the obligation to take care to all people's values, to not only advocate one certain group, but all layers of society. Realize you do this if you do this in Indonesia when the majority is Muslim, realize that on how many Muslims are going to backlash towards the government. Imagine your grandma you love that you thought when you're going to be buried in the very first place, you are already very sad because someone that you truly love left you. But then when you know that there's no memorable place for your grandma, it will make you even more sad than before. Your grandma is going to be burned and their final resting, and you will think it is not proper treatment to let them rest like that. And crucially, when the family doesn't have any right to deny it. And to make it even worse, in that cemetery are way too more expensive than having a cemeteries, and not all families could also afford it. So I don't really get on why they say that cemeteries is also affordable. But even if they are not very conservative, but realize that there are uncertainty of that and new practices, right? Because when someone is undergoing the death of their love, it's going to be very irrational, right? It types of uncertainty. You will get very stressed and emotional. In this fragile state, they shouldn't be bombarded with so much shame given that cremation. In order for them to properly grieve and gain more closure, need to hold on something normal and constant on what they usually stuck in their memories. For example, like common practice used by the burial. What will happen if you don't give them properly? People don't get enough closure. People don't accept they are being put that their memories from this person are not being respected. So what did I told you in this debate? Firstly, on how their side are so exclusive about the capitalized system, on how our side respecting all values of people, and we don't generalize all kind of values, and we mitigate their arguments about social pressure and how we more align to all people values and respecting all kind of better approach to all people. For all this reason, we stand for their on-site opposition.
Thank you, second speaker of the opposition team, for that speech. Now, to close the substantive part of the government's case, now let's call upon the third speaker here. Jogja, it's okay to turn off your camera if you're facing connectivity issues again.
Am I
Yeah.
close enough to the mic?
Can you get closer?
Okay, is it fine?
Yeah. Fine for me.
Wait. Oh, and if you just unmute yourself. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, death is the closure to life. If your life couldn't be equal or have closure, you deserve closure in death. So we believe that is the importance of our case. We believe that it is the responsibility of the government to actually make everyone equal when they actually is at the very end of their life, which is death. But before that, independent rebuttals for the government's case. They say that we are being assumptive that everyone has the same values, right? But they are dismissive of our characterization. But that even when someone actually have the same kind of value, they are still competing, right? They are still seen as when you get fancy crafts, it is better, even though you are, for example, Christian, for example, or maybe you're Muslim, the fancier your grave, you'll be seen as someone who is more honorable. We believe that they haven't responded to that case. But second, they say that some cemetery have different prices, right? There are cemeteries who are much cheaper, etc. But we believe that exactly when you actually opt out, you actually opt to the cheaper price, to the most cheaper, the most cheap choice, you would still be compared to the other families who can actually afford who can actually afford the more expensive crafts, right? So we believe the problem still exists in their side. So coming to the clashes of today's debate, there are two questions that needs to be answered by both sides of the house. First, whether it's justified, but second, whether it actually solves the problem that is actually happening. First, whether it's justified. We have explained to you thoroughly that no life should be honored more just because they are rich. Because uh, because you when you could actually afford those fancy crafts, it means that you are a rich person, right? And we have explained to you that those crafts would be bedazzled with marmors, for example, and have fresh flowers every day. It also happens in the Muslim community, for example, even if everyone's mandate from God is actually the same, right? Just bury it under the ground. We believe that this kind of disparity still happen inside of those community who share the same values, right? And this kind of graves, in this kind of graves that are better than the other ones beside it, it makes the illusion that they're actually better in life, that they actually deserve more honor. Meanwhile, what is the reality? The reality is that more often than not, they actually accumulate and gain those wealth because from exploiting their workers, for example, because they engage in the cruel capitalism, which we believe is not justified to make you seen as someone who is more honorable, right? And they say, and if they want to talk about culture, right, how Toraja people actually put the corpse inside of the caves, for example, and get ceremonies to feed the corpse, etc. We believe that the families that could actually afford those kind of ceremonies are the richer ones, right? Not everyone in those tribes could actually afford those ceremony that actually needs money, that actually needs sheep or cow being slaughtered, for example. We believe those kind of ceremonies are expensive and is not accessible for everyone in that tribe either. So we believe no equality could happen in their side of the house. Meanwhile, what is actually the responsibility of the government, right? We believe that the government has two kind of responsibility. First, maintain equality whenever it is possible. That is why the government is actually fighting to make the education free when it's possible, to make the healthcare free, because they believe that those education and healthcare is the right of every person, right? And we believe that death and equality when you're dead and closure when you're already dead is the right of everyone, because you eventually will face death, because everyone will eventually face death, and everyone has the right to be equal, right? So we believe that it is within our responsibility as a government. But second, we believe that the responsibility of the government is to maintain the rationality of the citizen, to make responsible spending, right? They have conceded in their second speaker that those kind of splurging when you do funerals, etc., those things are irrational, right? Which makes it an irresponsible spending, because it is not an investment and it is not actually productive. But what is actually rational, right? What is actually rational? No, thank you. It's actually continuing their legacy, expanding their business, or maybe building an orphanage under their name. We believe those things could actually honor those can actually honor your loved one's death, and is actually more productive and actually more rational, rather than only splurging to buy expensive lands and expensive coffins to make it look like you have actually paid respect to your loved ones. But second clash of this debate, but before that, POI, yes.
Do you think that
Hello?
death is
Yeah.
rational?
death is actually being faced by everyone, right? It is inevitable. So we believe that it is actually the government's responsibility to make sure that something that is as normal as death is being faced with something that is rational and is actually productive and not only spurging money. Meanwhile, those money could actually be used in something that is more beneficial, for example. But second, which side actually solved the problem? We believe that the economical harm is very real, right? We have brought to you that those kind of funeral companies are actually checking up their prices until even the most cheapest, even until the cheapest price possible is still overpriced, right? Because they know that the demand is very high in the society, right? They say that they could still just choose the cheapest one, but we have told you that that there would still be a social pressure, and you would be and people around you would gossip that you are not paying them the respect they deserve because you opt to the cheapest choice. You will be seen as not respecting your loved ones. Meanwhile, that is not actually the reality, right? You cannot actually see the economical condition of those people, right, who don't actually could actually afford those kind of funerals. So what will happen in their side of the house? People who actually could not afford is pressured to still use their money who could actually be used as something else, for example, for their healthcare, for their education. It is instead used in order to make sure that their mother's funeral is going to be fancy. We believe it is very unproductive and it's very pressuring, right? And then there are also pressure from the family itself, right? When a mother say to their child, like, say that make sure that my funeral is going to be fancy. We believe this is very unjustified and is actually putting the burden of people who don't deserve this kind of burden. But so why is this kind of capitalization won't actually happen in our side of the house? Because this kind of cremation and urns is inherently not being shown to the public, right? Different to what graves are. Graves could be seen by everyone. When you actually visit a grave, when you actually visit a graveland, you could see the next grave is actually better than your mother's, for example. We believe what's the difference in this kind of cremation? Those kind of urns are actually being kept in your homes, right? So there are no kind of pressure, there are no kind of jealousy, for example, when because you don't know what kind of other people what other people is actually doing to their family's urn, for example. So there is less social pressure, there is less responsibility for the feel of responsibility to actually make it fancy because you don't want other family to bash you, for example, or mock you and say that you're poor and that you do not pay the proper respect to your family. So what have we proven in our side? We have proven to you that is only justified if the government makes equality accessible for everyone, and equality could only exist in our side because those kind of pressure is invisible, and our side actually solve the economical problem that is very real. We win this debate. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, third speaker of the government, for their fine speech. Now to close the substantive part of the whole debate, let's call upon the third speaker of the opposition side. Here.
Okay, Kak, give me a second. Let me switch my Wi-Fi first because it says that my bandwidth is low. Okay, am I audible? I'm audible? Okay. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna start my speech. And POI, just unmute yourself.
I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, we think it's so horrible for side proposition to think that there is a proper way of grieving. That death is a one-size-fits-all scenario. Panel, we don't want to generalize how we grieve, and if we prove to you why this is more important than things like inequality and social pressures, we win this debate. We're so proud to oppose. Before I move on to my two clashes, I want to point out two strategic flaws from Proposition's case. Firstly, on their entire case on inequality and it being so inexpensive. Panel, I think there needs to be a clear delineation between funeral ceremonies and burial processes, right? Because what is actually expensive a lot of the times is the funeral ceremonies that will exist regardless of which side of the debate you are on. But also what is prone to things like societal pressures and judgment is things like public events of the funeral ceremonies, because we know that when you're putting this grave literally 5 feet under, it's usually very limited to only like 10 to 20 people. It's usually very limited to only the family, so it's not really prone to the societal pressures that they wanted to claim under their side of the house. But also on how government spending is on how government has an obligation to limit irrational spending. Panel, we think people have irrational spending all the time. If they want to solve irrational spending, then they have to, like, for example, opt into a government-controlled market, for example, like go into a communist system. We don't think, or we don't understand why this is a part of the debate at all. Before I move on to my two clashes, one extraneous rebuttal, which is on like saving land and etc. 3 responses. First of all, not all of the burial processes that we actually gave to you is space consuming, right? There are things like mass burials. There are things like in Raja Ampat where you put it in caves that are stacked on each other. But even if this isn't true, we think that side proposition never gets the link back of this tangible harm on like saving land, right? Because what side opposition already showed you is, for example, the process analysis as to why the lack of closure leads to a more unproductive society. Things like in COVID, when people weren't able to bury their families and see and grieve with their families when their loved one dies, there's things like mental health and unproductivity of people. So on to my first flash about which side of the house is more principally justifiable. Under this, we already told you 3 things, which is firstly, why you can't erase culture. Secondly, why death is spiritual. And thirdly, why we should respect people who die. What do we get in response? Well, one response of inequality and how it's inaccessible to the poor. Panel, death and the burial process isn't like education, where if you have more money, you will get better education. The exact reason why we support this motion is because better burial processes is arbitrary and subjective. Some people who love like the burial processes that are cheap, for example, environmentalists who want to opt into like green burials because it is much cheaper. But some people also think that burial processes are better when it's expensive, like what they talk about as a display of wealth. Realize that because of this, the current status quo doesn't exacerbate inequality, right? Because not only burial processes are private, but literally society has never told anyone that more expensive means that you are more valued. People take their ideologies and their own ideologies to judge this, right? Especially because death is so spiritual, these monetary values are insignificant. What matters more is like if it's according to their religion or their culture, because it's such a big part of their identity. We get no response on how their side of the house limits things like religious things and cultural things, which is usually way more valued than what society thinks of you. Panel, because literally religion is, for a lot of people, what determines if they go to heaven or hell. I think this is more important than knowing that your neighbor thinks of you as rich. But okay, let's say that this isn't true. A lot of times, the metric of a good grave for the poor isn't also the same as the metric of a good grave for the rich, right? A lot of times when you're poor, society sees that you're splurging so much, they will think of you as irrational and snobbish, even when you didn't have enough money to begin with. But even if this isn't true, the metric of good is not like the rich, where you expect extravagant burials, given that the fact that a lot of poor people haven't been able to go to like rich people funerals. They also don't see the standards of these like expensive burial processes. But even in our worst case scenario, if you want to make this debate about the metric of inaccessibility, we think that their side of the house is more inaccessible. We told you how a lot of times people lose their loved ones in the most shocking scenarios, or after leaving a bad impression on their loved ones as their last memory. At least under our side of the house, there's an extent to which you can control this letting go process and leaving the last memory of your parents. parents, right? Because unlike what they said, kids feeling like they did a good job in following their values of their parents is usually inaccessible. You don't know when your parents will die. It's usually likely that it's usually likely that you leave it on a bad note. We talked about how the shock of death is sometimes like uncontrollable. You literally have no control over this. So evidently, given the fact that you can at least control how much you spend, there is more access to closure under our side of the house for kids who didn't leave their parents, for example, on a good note. Why is this so important? Because their case is literally contingent upon inequality. But what they fail to show you is that inequality is such an arbitrary thing. They only wanted to talk about economic inequality. What about the inequality, so like access and having a good relationship to your parents? They didn't talk about this at all. But to my second clash about which side of the house brings more closure, right? We already told you how you can get closure only when you have a choice of grieving. Secondly, you can only get closure when there's like a gradual process. No, thank you. But also why the uncertainty of death and new practices is so harmful. What do we get response? Well, they talked about how harmful it is that funeral companies are capitalizing on this, right? Let's point out that this isn't the only form of burial process that we already highlighted from our very first speech. But I realize that this also isn't true, given that there is competition, there is a checks and balances. In fact, it's actually a very diverse because given that death is something not only exclusive for the rich people, for example, these funeral companies actually cater to different socioeconomic groups. There are burial companies for the poor and for the rich. Moreover, a lot of people are rational when they are making the decision of how to bury their loved ones. A lot of times they plan before when the person is alive. For example, this is why we have things like wills in the first place. And even if not, because they know burial is so important, they will attempt to think rationally and give decision makings. So for example, the figurehead of their family, for example, like the oldest sibling who is most mature and most rational. But even if this isn't true, families want to adhere to the last wishes of their dead person over societal pressure. For example, if the parents who passed away didn't taught them to not splurge too much on, for example, things like funerals, obviously they would value this more over the opinions, for example, of their friends and neighbors, because these loved ones are way more important to them and way more valued in their life. But even if we can see that there are these societal pressures that give you a metric as to how you can get closure, at least this very set metric allows this person to have closure, knowing that, okay, if I fulfill this, then I'm able to feel this closure, I'm able to go through this, in comparison to like arbitrary methods of like what closure is. There is no sort of metric for closure. But why is this so important? Because 3 reasons. Because first of all, panel, this was their biggest harm, that funeral companies and graveyards is so expensive. But let's do some weighing, because like our harm was literally that people don't get closure at all. They go into states of depression, panel, because in their worst case scenario, okay, it's expensive, but at least there is no this type of closure that they talk about at all. But secondly, on the magnitude of harm, because their magnitude of harm is contingent on only poor people who can't afford this, right? What about the people who are in cultural places? What about the people who are religious, who take more of the population, and like doing this generalization, they aren't able to actually feel this closure? But onto likeliness, at least we opt for choice. We opt for more choices of expense. There is more likeliness that it is cheap than any closure under their side that they haven't been willing to defend. We are so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for the speech. Now let's call upon the opposition reply to close the case of the entire opposition's case. Here.
Am I audible? Sorry. Okay.
Can you try again now?
Wait a second. There you go. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panels, we think that until the end of this debate, our definition still stands true, right? Because realize how in this debate, we've already continuously explained to you as to why death is simply an irrational thing, and that in order for you to be able to properly grieve, you need to choose, right? You need to choose your own way, because there is no one size fits all way of grieving, right? We don't think that that's something that is very likely. Two metric and how you're supposed to judge this debate. Firstly, as to why then it's justifiable for us to do this policy to begin with, but secondly, as to which side of the house can actually bring more benefit, right? So firstly, regarding the justification, right, our side of the house have already proven to three things. Firstly, they can't erase culture simply because of the benefit that they're trying to offer, right? We've already proven to you as to why these cultures have literally been practiced for like centuries, right? That this has been doing for like years and years, and the benefit is simply not going to weigh up as much as like the continuity of these culture itself. Secondly, we've also proven to you as to why death is a spiritual thing, and that's exactly why it's hard for you to make it in. It's hard for you to weigh it with the benefit in and of itself. Right? We don't think that someone will just simply let go of how they're supposed to be buried simply because of things like if government wants more land, right? We don't think that that's very likely. But thirdly, we also think that this is a way for us to be able to respect people, right? Realize how there is still a lot of people who are conservative, right? Realize how there's still a lot of people who are genuinely afraid that if they're not like buried according to their religion, that's exactly the moment in which they're gonna go to hell, right? We think that exactly because of that, the moment that proposition tries to say they're going to generalize everything, that's exactly the moment in which you're going to erase the identity of these people. We don't think that this is justifiable, right? But then what is it that we get under from side proposition's case, right? They tries to bring to you this idea of inequality, right? But we don't think that matters as much in this debate, right? Because realize how on our side of the house we also still have equality, right? Because realize how people all have different definitions as to how then they're supposed to be buried. And exactly our side of the house catered to this because we have multiple choices. People, if they wanted to be cremated, then they can do that under our side of the house. If they want a cheaper burial, then they can do that under our side of the house. We don't think that society is then going to look at you as like a horrible person if you don't give a proper funeral, because society will also always weigh in oh, maybe this person is not, cannot afford that, and that's still okay because they're still putting respect on their family, because they're still doing the last will of their family, right? I think that exactly because of that, the justification should be one under our side of the house, because we have least proof as to why these cultures need to go on, because it's part of a person's identity. This is exactly something that side proposition, until the end of this debate, have still yet not responded. So let's move on to the second part, right? Regarding closure. When our side of the house have already proven to you as to why we can get closure, right? Because because we let people choose, exactly because we have a slower pace when people is in the grieving process, right? Because obviously, if you don't really want to do a cremation, then we can still give you the option not to, right? We've also already proven to you as to why then the closure is going to be very important, because it's so hard for people when they're still grieving to go back to society, right? Most likely, if they don't grieve properly, then they're still going to be haunted with this event that they're not doing what their dad is supposed to tell them to do when their parents is alive, right? I think that exactly because of that, it's very important for you to have closure, and we think that our side of the house can actually achieve this, right? We don't really understand why closure will happen under side proposition, because you're forcing these people to only do grieving in one way. We don't think that this is a good thing. If you believe in that, you should vote for side opposition.
All right, thank you, opposition reply. To close the whole debate, let's call upon the government reply. Here.
Hello, am I speaking close enough to the mic?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. I'll be starting. Oh wait, I forgot to set my timer. Sorry. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Once again, death is the closure to life. If your life couldn't be equal, If you couldn't achieve your best in life or have closure, you deserve closure at least in death, right? Because you couldn't choose what kind of life you could have. You couldn't choose what kind of family you were born in. So everyone's ending should be the same in this life. We think that's only what is justified and what the government should uphold. Opposition agrees to this necessity of equality in death, right? Most of their responses say that the equality is not going to be exclusive. Let's show you why that's actually exclusive. But anyways, 4 reasons that we win. Firstly, we think that that they didn't respond sufficiently to our equality in death argument, right? If they want to uphold culture and closure, their BOP is why it's going to be accessible for everyone. But 3 reasons we win in this clash. Firstly, because equality in death cannot be achieved in opposition side because graveyards are determined by their money, right? How fancy it is, or even being able to get the land from the very first place. Because my first speaker has characterized how land is scarce and not everyone is going to be getting it in the first place, right? And graveyards are visible, and people are going to be pressured to make the grave as good as someone else's, right? They gave a late response in their third speaker. The ceremony will be also according to money, and it'll be unequal, right? But no, this was insufficient. This did not rebut the trauma that can be felt every time you visit the graveyard and realize that somebody else's grave is actually better than you, right? How will poor people not feel insecure in their side? How will they reach closure, right? Even just a rich relative can badmouth you because the characteristic of death is that it is so sacred. Poor people and people who are unfortunately born, never get closure on their side. Secondly, they didn't even respond to how governments can protect hospitals being built on top of graveyards, right? How do you protect that? Like, the land is already scarce, right? So the closure is a false sense of security because the graves can be destroyed in the future. And thirdly, their culture argument is also contingent on money and the availability of the people to hold the ceremonies from the very first place, right? This is why it's not important, because poor people might be unable to access it, or people who are busy working abroad might not be able to access it and like pay that much honor to their family, right? So the closure of the poor people's inability to access this is actually a more important thing, and especially because they didn't link back to why culture is the government's interest. Second reason we win, because they gave a contradiction. They said that death can be planned, like what kind of funeral you want, right? But then their third speaker said themselves that death can be unpredictable. It can come at unpredictable times, right? If you couldn't choose the timing of death, then nobody should have more control of how to have the closure of your death. Third reason we win. We think that it's atrocious to capitalize on people's death, right? You're already vulnerable because you lost your loved one, and then you're pressured by funeral industries to actually have the best coffin, for example, right? We think that even if there is no societal pressure, when people see the prices that these companies put up that largely differ, they naturally feel guilty if they cannot buy the best coffin, right? As if their life is not good enough because they couldn't respect their family enough, which opposition side also conceded that your respect matters on how good the death can be celebrated. We think this is atrocious, and there was no sufficient response. Fourth reason we win. Our argument about closure to the family is unresponded, right? In opposition side, their grandmothers will pressure to make a fancy coffin and leave flowers every day. This will be unachievable because of economic conditions, for example, or it's unpredictable, right? Or they're busy at work, right? Even if the family is kind, we think social pressure also exists to, for people to visit the graves that often, right? In our side, the closure is reached not by comparing with other people how you celebrate the death, but you just look at your own home and your photo of your father and focus on continuing the values of your father, for example, right? Have I been a man that's as great as my father, right? Not only do you let go of death faster on our side, but opposition side never responded why this is not going to be enough closure in our side, and it's going to be more accessible anyways, right? That's why we win.